The gatekeeper lived a quiet life that most people hardly noticed. Every morning before the sun had fully risen, he put on his simple uniform, buttoned it neatly, and walked to the tall iron gates of the company where he worked. His job was to open the gate for employees, greet them with a nod, and make sure nothing unusual happened around the entrance. He was always there, rain or shine, in the heat of summer and the cold of winter. For many, he was part of the background, just someone standing by the gate doing the same thing every day. Few bothered to learn more about him, but what no one at the office knew was that inside this quiet man lived a world of music. Behind his serious face and steady routine was a heart that beat in rhythm with melodies that he could almost hear everywhere. A passing bird's song, the sound of the wind brushing through trees, the soft patter of rain on the company roof. All of it reminded him of music. At night, after long shifts, he returned to his small home, where in one corner of his modest living room stood an old piano. It wasn't much to look at, its wood chipped and its keys a little yellowed with age, but to him it was a treasure. He had found that piano years ago, when a neighbor was moving away and no longer wanted it. The gatekeeper had offered to take it, though at that time he barely had space for it. Carrying it piece by piece with the help of two friends, he had brought it into his home, promising himself he would never let it go. From that day on, every free moment he had belonged to the piano. He played not for money, not for fame, but because it made him feel alive. His fingers, though rough from years of labor, moved gently across the keys. Sometimes he played songs he remembered from childhood. Sometimes he created his own tunes without thinking, just following the pull of his heart. He never had formal lessons, but the way he played could make someone pause and listen. The music carried emotion, telling stories of longing, of joy, of memories lost and found again. It was his way of speaking to a world that often rushed past him without stopping, but no one at the company knew this side of him. To them, he was just the man by the gate. When workers arrived in the morning, they greeted him with quick nods before hurrying inside. Some didn't even notice him at all. During his breaks, he sometimes sat quietly on a wooden stool, watching the cars pass by, his mind far away, dreaming of melodies. Yet he never spoke of his love for music. He feared people would laugh, or worse, dismiss him as foolish. After all, who would believe that a gatekeeper could play the piano with the heart of a musician? There were moments, however, when the secret almost slipped out. Once, while waiting outside the office during a small event, he heard a pianist performing inside. The music was bright, the kind that makes a room lively, but something about it felt empty to him. Without meaning to, he hummed a different tune under his breath, imagining how he would have played the same song, slower and gentler, letting each note breathe. A young employee walking by had overheard his humming and asked, "Do you play music?" He had quickly shaken his head and said no, brushing it off. He wasn't ready to reveal what lived inside him. Every day followed the same routine. He unlocked the gate in the morning, checked deliveries, kept an eye on the entrance, and locked the gate at night. It was simple work, and though it didn't bring wealth, it gave him enough to live quietly. Still, when he looked at his piano at night, he felt richer than many who passed him in suits during the day. His piano asked for nothing, yet gave him everything: comfort when he was lonely, peace when he was tired, and joy when he was unsure of his place in the world. Sometimes he wondered what life would have been like if things had been different. If he had been born into a family that could afford music lessons, or if someone had noticed his gift when he was younger. He imagined himself on a stage, lights above, people sitting silently waiting for his fingers to tell a story through the keys. But then the vision would fade, and he would smile gently at the old piano in his living room. "This is enough," he would whisper to himself. And in many ways it was. Yet life has a strange way of bringing secrets into the light. At the company, small conversations floated around now and then. Some workers spoke of their hobbies. One painted, another sang in a choir, another played guitar in a small band on weekends. The gatekeeper listened quietly, never sharing his own passion. But one evening, as a storm poured outside and he was locking the gate, a kind worker stayed behind to wait for a ride. The worker asked casually, "So do you do anything special outside of this job?" The gatekeeper hesitated, his hand resting on the wet iron gate. He almost said it then, that he played the piano, but he stopped himself. He only smiled and replied, "I just go home and rest." And so the days turned into weeks and the weeks into years, with his secret locked away like a hidden jewel. But destiny doesn't leave treasures buried forever. The company was preparing for an important celebration. Decorations were being planned, speeches were being written, and entertainment was being arranged. It was meant to be a night that left a strong impression on clients and employees alike. Everyone was busy and excitement filled the air. The gatekeeper, as always, stood quietly by the entrance, watching it all unfold. He listened to the plans with mild curiosity but said nothing. It was during one of these busy afternoons that someone, in half-jest, mentioned the gatekeeper and music. Nobody knows how the rumor began, but it drifted through small conversations. Some laughed at the idea, imagining him sitting at a piano. The thought seemed amusing because no one could picture the quiet man doing anything other than opening and closing the gate. Word eventually reached the boss, who laughed louder than anyone else. "If he plays the piano, I'll fire him," the boss joked, shaking his head. The others chuckled, treating it as nothing more than a silly thought. The gatekeeper overheard it. He was standing a few steps away, pretending not to listen. Inside, the word stung a little, not because of the threat but because of the laughter. They had no idea how much music meant to him, how it was the truest part of who he was, but he kept his face calm as he always did. He nodded at an employee walking past, locked the gate for the night, and went home. That evening he sat at his piano longer than usual. His fingers moved slowly at first, then with more strength, as though the keys could understand the feelings he held inside. The laughter of the boss echoed in his memory, but the piano answered with a voice far more powerful. He played until the night grew quiet, until the music softened his heart again. He told himself it didn't matter what others thought. Yet deep down he wondered if life would ever give him a chance to show the truth, that behind the uniform of a gatekeeper lived a musician waiting to be heard. The days after the boss's joke carried on as usual, but something inside the gatekeeper had shifted. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was only a passing remark, something not meant to be taken seriously. Yet the words echoed in his mind. "If he plays the piano, I'll fire him." They had been spoken with laughter, but to him they had cut deep. It was as if someone had mocked not just a hidden talent, but a part of his soul. Every morning he returned to his post at the gate, his face calm as always, greeting employees with a small nod. Outwardly, nothing had changed, but inwardly he felt a weight, a secret stirring that refused to be quiet. The piano at home seemed to call louder each night, almost urging him not to let the joke bury his love for music. Instead of discouraging him, it pushed him to play more. His evenings grew longer, his music stronger. It was as though the keys could sense his pain and responded with melodies that soothed him. At the company, though, the teasing didn't stop. A few younger employees, overhearing the joke, began to mention it lightly whenever they saw him. "Hey, gatekeeper, when are you giving us a concert?" one said with a grin. Another joked, "Careful, if the boss hears you play, you'll be out of a job." They laughed, thinking it was harmless fun. He forced a polite smile, but inside he felt a mix of sadness and quiet defiance. They didn't know that while they were laughing, he was carrying music that could silence them all. The boss himself forgot about the remark. To him it was just another moment of humor, tossed aside and forgotten. But life has a way of weaving plans even from careless words. Soon, the preparations for the company's big celebration grew more intense. It was going to be an evening event with important clients, partners, and employees attending. The boss wanted everything to be perfect: grand speeches, fine food, and music to keep the atmosphere lively. A band had been hired, including a pianist who was well known in the local area. The boss mentioned it proudly to the staff, saying it would be an event people would remember. The gatekeeper listened quietly as he stood by the door. He imagined the pianist performing, the sound filling the hall. A small part of him ached, wishing he could be the one to play, but he quickly pushed the thought aside. "It's not my place," he reminded himself. His job was the gate, nothing more. But fate was already moving in the background. A week before the celebration, a problem arose. The hired pianist had to cancel unexpectedly due to illness. Panic rippled through the office. The band could still play, but without a pianist, their performance would lose its charm. The boss was furious, pacing back and forth, demanding solutions. "We can't have this kind of failure," he barked. "Find someone else." Finding a replacement on such short notice was nearly impossible. Good pianists were either booked or too expensive for the budget. Stress grew each day as the event drew closer. That was when a quiet suggestion slipped into the conversation. One of the employees, half smiling, said, "What about the gatekeeper?" Didn't someone say he plays the piano? The room burst into laughter. The boss threw his head back and laughed louder than all. Him? Don't be ridiculous. He can barely manage the gate, and you think he'll impress our clients on a piano? No, we need a real musician. Everyone chuckled along, and the matter was dropped quickly. But the seed had been planted. A few workers, curious, began whispering among themselves. Could it be true? Did the quiet man at the gate really know music? Some thought it was impossible. Others wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than they had assumed. The gatekeeper overheard these whispers too. He said nothing, but inside his heart raced. A strange feeling of fear and hope mixed together. That night, back at home, he sat at his piano in the dim light. He touched the keys gently as though they could answer his questions. What if they found out? He thought. What if I really played in front of them? For years, he had hidden this part of himself, afraid of judgment. Yet now judgment had already come in the form of laughter and disbelief. Could playing truly make things worse? The piano responded with a soft melody, one that rose slowly, tenderly, then grew strong, as if reminding him of his worth. Each note seemed to tell him that gifts are not meant to be hidden forever. He closed his eyes and let the music carry him, imagining for a moment that he was not in his small room, but on a stage where people listened not to the man in the uniform, but to the soul behind the music. Over the next few days, he played harder, longer, pouring his emotions into the piano. His fingers, though tired from long shifts, danced across the keys with more passion than ever. It was as if he was preparing himself, even though no one had asked him to. Something inside told him that his moment was coming, whether he was ready or not. Meanwhile, the company continued to struggle with the missing pianist. The band suggested finding anyone who could at least play basic tunes to keep the flow of the music. But the boss refused to settle for less. This night must be perfect, he repeated again and again. Still, options were few, and time was running out. On one particularly stressful afternoon, when the boss was venting about the problem again, the same worker who had joked earlier spoke up once more. Why not give the gatekeeper a chance? What's the harm in trying? It's better than having no pianist at all. The room fell silent for a moment, then erupted into chuckles. The boss shook his head, amused and annoyed. I already said it. If he plays the piano, I'll fire him. He declared once more, his voice echoing through the office. But this time the words didn't land the same way. Some employees exchanged curious glances. They weren't sure if it was still just a joke or if maybe deep down there was something worth testing. The gatekeeper heard about it soon after. Standing by the gate, he kept his face calm, but inside his heart beat faster. The idea of playing in front of everyone both terrified and thrilled him. What if he failed? What if the boss humiliated him in front of everyone? Yet another thought followed closely behind. What if I succeed? That night, when he returned home, he didn't just play. He practiced as though the event was already waiting for him. His hands trembled at first, but soon they grew steady. The piano filled the room with melodies of strength, hope, and hidden fire. He could almost see the faces of the employees listening, the silence of surprise, the boss's disbelief. For the first time, he allowed himself to dream not just of playing for himself, but of showing the world who he truly was. Outside, the rain tapped gently on the window. Inside, the piano sang louder than the storm. The gatekeeper, once only a shadow at the company's entrance, was preparing for a moment he didn't yet know would change everything. The night of the company's grand celebration finally arrived. The building had been decorated with shining lights, long tables of food and flowers at every corner. Employees dressed in their best clothes filled the hall, their voices buzzing with excitement. Important clients had begun to arrive, and the boss moved from group to group, greeting them with broad smiles and handshakes. Everything seemed ready, yet there was still a sense of unease. The band was tuning their instruments, but the absence of a pianist hung heavy in the air. The boss tried to act confident, insisting that the music would be fine without one. It will still be a good show, he told a client, though his eyes betrayed his worry. He wanted the night to be flawless, and deep down he knew something was missing. The employees whispered among themselves, many recalling the old joke about the gatekeeper. For some reason, his name came up again, more seriously this time. A few wondered if it was worth trying. Outside, the gatekeeper stood at his post as usual, even though the event was already underway. He wore his uniform, simple and neat, and watched as cars continued to pull up. Drivers dropped off guests in expensive suits and dresses, their laughter echoing as they entered the building. From where he stood, he could hear the muffled sound of the band starting to play inside. Part of him longed to see what was happening in the hall, but he knew his place was at the gate. That was his duty, and he had accepted it long ago. Yet, as the night grew louder with celebration, his mind wandered back to his piano at home. He imagined the feel of the keys beneath his fingers, the sound of music filling the air, the way people might stop and listen. The dream felt far away, but on this night, closer than ever before. Inside the hall, the missing pianist became a bigger problem than anyone expected. The band did their best, but their songs felt incomplete. Some guests smiled politely, but many whispered that the music seemed flat. The boss grew increasingly nervous. He excused himself from a group of clients and stepped aside, scolding the event organizer. "This is embarrassing. We needed the piano. Without it, the whole evening loses its charm." That was when a bold voice rose from the group of employees nearby. "Why don't we let the gatekeeper try?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. A few heads turned, and a ripple of surprise went through the crowd. The boss's face darkened, and he barked out a laugh, loud and dismissive. "That again? Haven't I made it clear? If he plays the piano, he's fired. Do you want to turn this into a circus?" But this time the laughter did not spread so easily. A few employees shifted uncomfortably. Some clients, curious, asked, "What's this about a gatekeeper playing the piano?" The boss waved it off as nonsense, but the question had already been planted in the minds of many. The whispers grew, and soon several people were asking if the story was true. The pressure built until finally, the event organizer approached the boss quietly and said, "Sir, maybe it wouldn't hurt to at least see? People are curious now. If he really can't play, we'll know in seconds and we can move on. But if he can, well, maybe it will save the night." The boss frowned, clearly unhappy with the idea, but with the eyes of so many guests now on him, he felt cornered. Finally, he sighed sharply and said, "Fine, bring him in. Let's put an end to this nonsense." An employee hurried outside to fetch the gatekeeper. The man looked up in surprise when he saw the worker rushing toward him. "The boss wants you inside," the worker said breathlessly. "They want you to play the piano." The gatekeeper froze. His hands, which had been resting calmly at his side, suddenly felt heavy. For years he had dreamed of a moment like this, yet now that it had come, fear gripped him. "Me play? In front of everyone?" he asked quietly. The worker nodded, urging him forward. "Come on. This is your chance." Heart pounding, the gatekeeper stepped through the doors of the building. For the first time, he was not invisible. All eyes turned toward him as he entered the decorated hall. Guests whispered, employees stared, and the boss stood with folded arms, a smirk on his face as though already anticipating failure. The piano stood near the band, polished and waiting. It seemed to shine under the lights, calling him forward. Slowly, he walked across the hall, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He could feel the weight of every gaze upon him, the unspoken doubt, the quiet amusement. Reaching the piano, he rested his hand on the smooth surface, closing his eyes for a moment to gather courage. The boss chuckled from across the room. "Go ahead then," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Show us what you can do." The gatekeeper sat down, his back straight, his fingers trembling slightly as they hovered above the keys. For a second, the room seemed too big, the silence too heavy. His mind screamed at him to walk away, to escape before he made a fool of himself. But then he remembered the countless nights at home, the hours of playing alone, the way the piano had always been there for him. Slowly, he drew in a deep breath and his fingers touched the keys. The first notes rang out, soft and uncertain but clear. The sound drifted through the hall, and the chatter fell completely silent. Encouraged, he let his hands move with more confidence, the music flowing from him like water breaking free of a dam. The tune he chose was one he had written himself, a melody born of quiet nights and hidden dreams. As he played, the nervousness melted away. His body swayed slightly with the rhythm, his eyes closed, his face calm. The piano no longer felt like an instrument, it was a voice speaking truths he had never dared to say. Each note carried emotion, telling the story of his life, the long hours of loneliness, the joy of finding comfort in music, the pain of being unseen, and the beauty of holding on to a dream. The hall was entranced. Guests leaned forward, their expressions softening, their hearts caught in the pull of the music. Some clasped their hands together, Some closed their eyes and others simply stared, unable to look away. Even the band members, who had expected nothing, were struck by the depth of what they heard. Across the room, the boss's smirk faded. At first, he tried to maintain a look of amusement, but as the melody deepened, he grew still. His arm slowly dropped from his chest, his eyes fixed on the man at the piano. Something in the music unsettled him, not because it was loud or showy, but because it was pure. It carried honesty, something money or status could not buy. The song built higher, stronger, until it filled the hall with a richness that no one had expected. The gatekeeper's fingers danced across the keys with grace, yet every note was heavy with feeling. Time seemed to stop, the world shrinking down to just the man and his piano. When the final notes faded, the silence was so deep it almost rang in the ears. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, as if a spell had broken, the hall erupted into applause. Guests stood to their feet, clapping and cheering, their faces glowing with admiration. Some shouted words of praise, others simply clapped harder, their eyes shining. The gatekeeper remained seated, his head bowed slightly, his hands still resting on the keys. He had not played for applause, only to share what lived in his heart. But the sound of people cheering, the sight of faces lit with awe, filled him with a warmth he had never known before. Among the clapping and cheering, one figure remained still. The boss, stunned, could only stare. His words, his laughter, his mocking, all of it now seemed small, foolish, and wrong. For the first time, he looked at the gatekeeper not as just a man at the gate, but as someone far greater, someone who had carried a gift in silence, waiting for the right moment to be heard. The night had been saved. But more than that, it had been transformed. The guests would not remember the food or the speeches as much as they would remember the man who rose from the gate to the piano and played as if the music had always been inside him. And as the applause continued, the gatekeeper sat quietly, a gentle smile on his face, knowing that his secret was no longer hidden. The sound of applause still echoed in the hall long after the gatekeeper lifted his hands from the piano keys. He sat there for a few seconds, almost unsure if everything he had just experienced was real. All around him, people clapped, some even whistled, and a few guests were on their feet cheering as though they had just witnessed something extraordinary. For years, his music had been hidden within the four walls of his small home, but tonight it had broken free and the world had finally heard it. He stood up slowly, his face calm but his heart racing wildly inside. He had never been surrounded by so many eyes, and yet, for the first time in his life, he did not feel invisible. The employees who had once laughed now looked at him with wide eyes full of respect. Clients who had entered the hall expecting nothing more than a formal evening leaned toward each other, whispering in amazement. The band members nodded at him with silent admiration. The boss, however, remained frozen in his spot. His arms hung awkwardly at his side, his confident smile nowhere to be found. He had been silenced not by words but by the truth in the music. The gatekeeper had not just played the piano, he had spoken through it. And the boss, who had mocked him so loudly, now had nothing to say. A few employees began to chant softly, "Encore, encore." Others joined, and soon the whole hall was asking for more. The gatekeeper hesitated. He had only meant to play once, to answer the challenge that had hung over him for so long. But as he looked around at the eager faces, something stirred inside him. This was not a test anymore. It was a chance. He sat back down, closed his eyes, and began another piece. This one was slower, softer, like a lullaby carrying the weight of memories. The notes floated gently through the air, calming the energy of the room, drawing people into a quiet stillness. Guests leaned back in their chairs, some even closing their eyes, letting the music wash over them. The melody was filled with tenderness, almost like a conversation between his heart and the world, one that said, "This is who I am. This is what I've carried all along." By the time the second song ended, some people had tears in their eyes. The applause was not as loud as the first time, but it was deeper, filled with gratitude. The hall had been transformed into something far more personal than a company celebration. It had become a place where strangers shared a moment of truth together. When the gatekeeper stood again, the boss was finally forced to move. Clearing his throat, he walked toward the piano, each step heavy. For a moment, no one knew what he would say. Some feared he might try to make another joke, but his face showed no trace of humor. Reaching the piano, he extended his hand slowly. "That," he began, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it, "was unexpected. The hall went silent, waiting for more. The boss looked around at the guests, at their impressed expressions, and then back at the gatekeeper. "You have given us something I did not think possible tonight. And he paused, almost choking on the words. "I was wrong." The gatekeeper looked at the boss for a long moment before shaking his hand politely. He did not gloat or remind him of his earlier mockery. He only nodded with a calm smile, as if to say the music had already spoken for him. The rest of the night carried a different energy. People who had barely noticed the gatekeeper before now approached him eagerly. Some asked where he had learned to play. Others complimented the emotions in his music. One client even suggested that he could perform at bigger venues, hinting that his talent was too great to stay hidden. The gatekeeper listened humbly, answering in short, simple words, his modesty only deepening people's admiration. The employees, who had always passed him by without a second thought, now looked at him with pride, as if he were one of their own who had accomplished something remarkable. Even those who had teased him earlier felt a sting of guilt, remembering their careless jokes. One by one they came up to him, some apologizing quietly, others simply saying, "That was beautiful." As the evening drew on, the gatekeeper found himself seated at a table with people he never imagined speaking to. Conversations flowed, and for once he was not the invisible man by the gate. He was the musician who had lifted the night into something unforgettable. Meanwhile, the boss sat at his own table, unusually quiet. His mind replayed the scene over and over, the laughter, his bold words, and then the way the music had stripped all of that away. He realized how easily he had judged someone by their position, by their uniform, by his own pride. The truth now stood clear. Talent and worth were not bound by titles or jobs. He had almost ruined the night with his arrogance, and only the gatekeeper's hidden gift had saved it. When the event finally ended and guests began leaving, the boss approached the gatekeeper once more. This time his tone was different, not sharp, not mocking, but respectful. "I owe you an apology," he said firmly. "And not just for tonight. I underestimated you. I let my pride blind me. You've shown all of us something rare." The gatekeeper met his gaze calmly. He had no anger left, no bitterness. The music had already healed that. "I was only doing what I love," he replied softly. "Nothing more." The boss nodded, feeling the weight of those words. "Well, from now on, you'll never be just the man at the gate in my eyes. You've earned more than that." The gatekeeper did not ask for promises or rewards. He did not dream of riches or sudden fame. All he wanted was to keep playing, to keep sharing the part of himself that had been hidden for so long. That night, however, he returned home with a heart lighter than ever before. When he sat at his old piano, the keys seemed to glow under his fingers, and the music that filled the small room was brighter, freer, carrying the memory of applause and respect. The story of the gatekeeper's performance spread quickly. By the next day, the company was buzzing with talk. Employees who had not attended the event asked excitedly what had happened. Guests who had been there told others about the surprising talent they had witnessed. The tale of the gatekeeper at the piano became a favorite story, repeated with amazement and admiration. The boss, once known for his sharp tongue, found himself humbled whenever the story was told. He never again joked about the gatekeeper or dismissed him as just another worker. Instead, he often spoke of him with pride, telling new clients, "You wouldn't believe what hidden talent we have right at our gates." But more than the admiration of others, what mattered most to the gatekeeper was the feeling inside him. He no longer carried the weight of being unseen. He no longer played in the shadows of his living room alone. He had shared his music, and in return, people had listened. That was enough to give him peace. Yet deep inside, he also knew that this was not the end. The night had opened a door he had never dared to knock on before. Where that door led, he did not yet know, but for the first time in years, he was ready to step through it. The days after the event felt unreal to the gatekeeper. For years, he had been the man standing quietly at the gate, nodding at cars, opening doors, and fading into the background. Now, when people passed by him, they no longer saw just the uniform or the job. They saw the man who had filled a hall with music and left a crowd speechless. Some employees stopped to greet him warmly, others shared a kind word, and even strangers visiting the office whispered about the pianist at the gate. At first, he was shy about the attention. He had spent most of his life blending in, unnoticed. But slowly he began to realize that what had happened was not just a moment, it was a turning point. His music, which he once thought belonged only to himself, had touched others. And that connection gave him courage he never had before. One morning, while he was on duty, a young boy approached him with wide eyes and a smile. "Sir, are you the one who played at the party?" the child asked. The gatekeeper chuckled softly and nodded. The boy's mother explained that her son was learning piano but often grew discouraged. "He wanted to quit," she said. "But when he heard about you, he said, if someone can play like that even while working as a gatekeeper, then I can keep learning too." The gatekeeper's heart warmed. That was the first time he truly understood that his gift was more than just notes and melodies. It could inspire. Soon, the story spread beyond the company walls. A local newspaper picked it up after one of the guests at the event shared it with a journalist. The headline read, "From Gate to Grand Piano, the hidden talent that stunned everyone." The article described not just his music, but the lesson it carried, that greatness can live in the most unexpected places. Within days, people from the neighborhood began to approach him. Some invited him to play at small gatherings. Others asked if he could teach their children. The gatekeeper never saw himself as a teacher, but he agreed, remembering how much music had shaped his own life. At first, he taught only 1 or 2 children after his work hours. He used his old, slightly broken piano at home, guiding their small hands gently over the keys. He didn't teach them with strictness or pressure. He taught them with patience, reminding them that music was not about perfection, but about expression. His little home, once quiet and lonely, now echoed with laughter and clumsy but sincere attempts at melodies. Meanwhile, at the company, the boss had changed as well. He had been deeply humbled that night. Where once he would walk past the gatekeeper without a word, now he often stopped to ask how he was doing. Once he even stood by quietly as the gatekeeper showed a child how to play a simple tune at the gatehouse piano someone had gifted him. The boss later admitted to a colleague, "That man taught me more about respect in one night than I learned in years." Months passed, and the gatekeeper's life slowly transformed. He was still devoted to his job, never careless with his duties, but now he carried something new, a sense of dignity that could not be taken away. He was no longer invisible. One evening, the company hosted another event. This time, the piano stood in the hall not for hired musicians, but for him. He hesitated when they first asked, worried it would feel like a show, but the employees insisted. "We want you to play because you're part of us," they said. And so, with a deep breath, he sat down once more. The moment his fingers touched the keys, the hall grew quiet, just as before. This time, however, there was no tension, no doubt, no challenge to prove himself. The music flowed easily, like water finding its path. The guests smiled, swaying gently to the sound. Some even hummed along. It was not just a performance, it was a celebration of something that belonged to all of them now. The story of the gatekeeper, who became a musician in their eyes. That night, after the applause, one of the older employees came up to him and said, "You don't just play music. You remind us that every person has something inside worth listening to." The gatekeeper carried those words with him long after the event ended. As the years went on, he continued working at the gate, but he also built a quiet reputation as the man who played the piano with heart. Children from the neighborhood grew into teenagers under his gentle teaching, and some even performed in school recitals thanks to him. Parents often thanked him, saying he had given their children not only music but also confidence. And yet, through it all, he never lost his humility. Whenever people praised him, he would smile and say, "I am just a man who loves the piano." Looking back, he realized something important. Life had never given him luxury or fame, but it had given him a gift, and sharing that gift was more powerful than anything else. The night he played in front of the company had not made him rich, but it had given him something priceless: respect, belonging, and the joy of touching lives. The boss, too, carried his own lesson. He no longer measured people by their job titles or their positions. He often reminded new staff, treat everyone with respect. You never know what stories or talents they hold. The gatekeeper's story eventually became a quiet legend in the company. New employees heard it from older ones, and every time they looked at him, they saw not just a man in uniform, but a symbol of something greater. And for the gatekeeper himself, every evening when he sat at his old piano, He felt a deep peace. He remembered the nights when his music stayed locked inside those four walls, and he was grateful for the moment it had finally been set free. He had once believed he was invisible, but now he knew the truth. No gift, no matter how hidden, stays in the dark forever. When the time comes, it will shine not for pride, not for applause, but to remind others of the beauty that can live quietly in ordinary people. And so, the man at the gate lived out his days not as just a worker, not as just a musician, but as someone who proved that respect and kindness grow when we choose to see people for who they truly are. His music continued to echo in the lives of those he touched, long after the final note faded into silence. Time moved forward, but the story of the gatekeeper never really faded. What had once been a single unforgettable night in the company hall became the beginning of something far greater, something that stretched far beyond the walls of the office or the uniform he wore each day. He still arrived every morning at the gate, greeting people with the same quiet smile. But now he was no longer just a shadow in the background. People looked for him. They stopped to talk even when they were in a hurry. They asked how he was, how his students were doing, if he was still practicing. And always he answered with gentle words and a simple nod, never letting pride take root in his heart. But little by little, his life began to expand. He was no longer the man who only guarded a gate and returned to a silent home. His small house had become a place of learning, laughter, and hope. Every evening after work, children from the neighborhood gathered there. Some were shy, some restless. Some came with no idea of music at all, but all of them left with more than just a few notes memorized. They left with the sense that they could be more than they imagined. The old piano, with its worn keys and scratches, was no longer just his companion. It became the heartbeat of the neighborhood. Parents stood outside listening, smiling at the sounds of clumsy scales slowly turning into melodies. Sometimes other adults asked if they could sit in and listen. A few even confessed they had always wanted to play but never had the chance. He welcomed them too, reminding them that music was not only for the young but for anyone with a heart willing to listen. One evening, as he guided a boy through a simple tune, the child asked innocently, "Why don't you play in big places like on TV or in concerts?" The question lingered in the air. He paused for a moment, then smiled. "Because my music belongs here," he said softly. With people who need it, he meant it. For him, fame was never the goal. Touching hearts was enough. Still, the world had a way of reaching for him. The newspaper article had caught the attention of a small cultural center in the city. One day, a representative came to visit him at the gate. She explained that they were hosting a community concert to celebrate hidden talents, and they wanted him to perform. At first, he refused politely. He didn't see himself as a performer on a stage, but she insisted gently, saying, "You've already inspired many. Let them hear you. They need to see that greatness is not about where you work, but about what you carry inside." After much thought, he agreed. The night of the concert, he walked onto the stage in simple clothes, far humbler than the other performers dressed in polished suits and dresses. Some in the audience murmured, unsure of what to expect. But when his hands touched the keys, the room shifted. The music was pure, filled with honesty, and it carried a weight no polished act could match. He played not to impress but to share, and by the time he finished, the audience was on their feet, clapping not for a show but for a story that had reached their hearts. That performance opened new doors. Invitations followed, from schools, from small theaters, from local gatherings. Each time he hesitated, but each time he remembered the faces of the children he taught, the hope they carried, and he agreed. Slowly, he became more than the man at the gate. He became known as the man whose music reminded people of the dignity in every life. At the company, his role shifted too. Though he still stood proudly at the gate, the boss and employees often asked him to play at special events. The boss, who had once mocked him, now introduced him proudly as our own pianist. He was no longer invisible, and his presence brought unity to the workplace. People who had once been divided by roles or pride now found common ground in respecting him. Yet, through all of this, the gatekeeper remained grounded. His evenings still belonged to the children. He still fixed the squeaky pedals of his old piano with his own hands. He still rose early each morning to stand at the gate. Fame never changed his rhythm of life because he knew where his music truly belonged. One day, years later, A young man returned to see him. It was the same boy who once wanted to quit piano after struggling. Now grown, he stood tall and confident, holding a small folder in his hands. Inside were certificates and letters. He had been accepted into a music academy. Tears filled the gatekeeper's eyes as the young man bowed slightly and said, "I wouldn't have made it here without you." Moments like these reminded him why he continued. It wasn't about applause, but about planting seeds that would grow long after his own notes faded. As time passed, his story spread even further. Documentaries were made about hidden talents in ordinary lives, and his name was always mentioned. Schools told his story to inspire students. He never sought the attention, but he accepted it when it came, knowing it could encourage someone else to believe in themselves. The boss, now older and gentler, often sat beside him during breaks at the gate. Once, the boss admitted quietly, "The night you played changed me. I used to think power was in position and authority, but you showed me power lies in honesty and the gifts we carry. Thank you for teaching me." The gatekeeper only smiled. For him, teaching was never about words. It was always about the music, and so the years unfolded. The gatekeeper grew older, his hair silvering, his hands slower, but his passion never dimmed. The children he taught grew into adults, some becoming musicians, others carrying music as a lifelong joy even if they chose different paths. His influence rippled quietly through the lives he touched, like gentle waves spreading far from their source. Near the end of his life, when his hands trembled too much to play long pieces, he would sit by the piano and strike a few keys, letting the sound linger in the air. Sometimes former students would visit, playing for him as he once had for them. The roles had reversed, but the circle was complete. On his final evening at home, as twilight settled outside, he sat at the piano one last time. He closed his eyes, let his fingers fall on the keys, and played a soft, imperfect tune. It wasn't flawless, but it carried everything he had lived: struggles, humility, respect, and the joy of sharing music with the world. When the last note faded, he smiled. He had never sought glory, never chased wealth, yet he had lived a life richer than most because he had given the world what was inside him. And long after he was gone, people still told the story of the gatekeeper who played the piano. Parents told their children, teachers told their students, and the company that once mocked him kept his memory alive as a lesson for every new employee. His legacy was not written in money or titles, but in hearts touched, in respect earned, in music that would never be forgotten. In the end, the man who once stood quietly at a gate became a doorway himself, a doorway through which others learned to see beyond uniforms, beyond roles, into the true worth hidden inside every human being. And in that way, his song never ended.